Hello and welcome to another Sneak Live session. So happy to have you here tuning in wherever you are in the world. If you're watching on Twitter this time, or Twitch, or YouTube, or maybe you're watching the recording of this, thank you so much for tuning into another live stream, another video. And you're joining us for another episode of Vuln of the Month, but now called Vulns Unleashed, with your two hosts, myself, Brian Clark, and our co-host over here, Kyle Swearer. Hey, Kyle. Good to see you, buddy. How are you doing?
Hey Brian, how's it going?
It's going well. It's going well. I'm excited to jump into yet another vulnerability to kind of dissect and learn a little bit more, especially coming from that beginner developer perspective, understanding these security topics. And I'm gonna rely on you quite a bit, my friend, to educate me on all this stuff, because this one's a little bit more out of my wheelhouse.
Definitely, yeah. I think this is less AppSec and this is more like OS level. So it's kind of interesting. I think it's a little different than what we've been doing. I think the new title is going to be a little more reflective too of what we're doing because it feels like we did one of these just last week, but there's so much interesting stuff. Pwnkit was just starting to really come to fruition, and we're just starting to see exploits. Maybe like a day or two before you and I last did this. So I think having it called Vulns Unleashed instead of Vulns of the Month is going to be way more reflective of what we're going to do going forward.
Yeah, for sure. I think I like the name. It's just very like we're unleashing it sounds like we're unleashing vulnerabilities, but we're not, right?
Right. It really does sound like we are. Yeah, nothing nefarious going on here. All this stuff is out there in the open. It's all public, and we're just going to do our best to just educate folks as much as we can.
Yeah,
So um, yeah, I think we've got a lot of recurring guests in the chat. Welcome to everybody in the chat. And feel free to drop a message in anytime, question if you don't understand what's going on. Like happy to have y'all here and happy to answer any questions that we can.
for sure, for sure. So let's jump into it then. What do you say?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So for this month's Vulns Unleash, or not even this month's because we might have a different cadence, right? But for this episode of it, we're gonna take a look at this what's called Pwnkit, which is based on a operating system utility. And you keep me honest here. So this is me being like, oh, I kind of know this stuff a little bit. I'm learning about it. It's Pwnkit, right?
Yeah, yeah. So basically, the suite of tools in Linux, which is responsible for this vulnerability, is called Pwnkit. And Pwnkit is relatively new as far as Linux goes, and it means policy kit.
Hmm.
And basically, it's a component for controlling system-wide privileges in Unix-like operating systems. So that is, a little TLDR on it. It's been around since 2009. It's developed by Red Hat. It has the LGPL license, and it's C primarily because it's basically, at this point, a module of the Linux operating system.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Well, that's really interesting. So if it's a module of the underlying Linux operating system, does that mean, and Linux is used all over the place, does that mean it's quite widespread? Or there's a
Yeah,
possibility of it being quite widespread?
yeah. You can get it on everything from like super common, Debian-based distros such as Ubuntu and Debian itself, of course. So very very common. Definitely has the most breadth of packages available readily throughout their repositories. So one of the most prolific operating systems for developers. Developers make a lot of stuff for Ubuntu, and it's largely backed by Canonical, which is a company, and Debian itself is a project just made by a person. So and Ubuntu obviously based off of that, so standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak.
Mhm.
But basically Red Hat came out with this, and this is a way for, let's say, a program that shouldn't have root privileges, shouldn't have access to everything on the box, being able to run a command as a elevated permission set, right?
Okay.
So if you needed a user, right, and this user, principle of least privilege here applied, meaning, give people access to as little as possible. That's a really good security principle. Just give them exactly what they need to do their job, right? That's principle of least privilege in a nutshell.
Wait, I
So
shouldn't give everybody access to everything possible? Just to
exactly,
make it easy, because you never know
it
when they
might be
might ask
easy,
for
right?
more, Kyle.
It
They
might
might
be easy, yeah, yeah. That's why 100% what you're saying. Like that's part of the reason why this exists, right? Let's
Mm,
say you need somebody to run a process, and that's going to reach maybe across this device into root, what we call like root or kernel space, and it needs to do some complex operation, and it's something that you don't want to happen in user land, right? Like
mm,
where all these hosts, maybe you have 50 people who are remotely connecting to this box, right? Maybe it's just 10, but either way, they have different things that they need, right? Maybe they have different subsections of user space, right? They're not all logging in as the same user. They all have their own users, and they're doing different things, right? So from like a Linux perspective, right? Like what you do is you would basically have all these different users, and they'd have different groups, and you'd apply these policies to the groups, right? Like this
okay.
group can do this, and root has gone through a lot of different iterations. It used to be called wheel, and it's basically the concept hasn't changed. Everything in Linux is a file. So files basically give people access to permissions, and then whoever has access to that file can read or write um, that file, right? And then add more people. So at the lowest level, that's really what happens because everything's a file in Linux. So Polkit was really just a convenient way for folks to do things as admin, as root, or any elevated permission group subset without actually being in that file and having that permission, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's almost like temporary elevated permissions for somebody that doesn't normally have that level of permission. Am I
Yeah.
understanding that?
Yeah. It's like temp admin,
Okay.
just like for one command or two commands or, a subset of commands.
Okay,
So
so I could see why that might be enticing to somebody like an attacker, be like, this might be an avenue I can take advantage of to see if I can break out of the context of an unprivileged user to a more privileged user."
exactly. I usually say that like vulnerability exists on the perimeter of functionality, right?
Mm,
So like you make something and you have it in mind that somebody's going to do X, Y, and Z. You don't think they're going to misuse or abuse, right, what you're
mhm,
creating.
mhm.
But the perimeter of functionality, right? What you define and what you don't define as legitimate or illegitimate or permitted and disallowed. That's where vulnerability exists, right? So
Yeah.
and
Well, I
mm,
definitely can, attest to that mentality of from a developer's perspective of like, yeah, they're j it's gonna be used the way I intended it to be used, of course, why would anybody do differently, right? Like,
exactly.
nobody's gonna click that extra button that's hidden or whatever, like, nobody's gonna enter this different string of text that I'm not expecting. They're always gonna do
Exactly.
what I expect them to do, the way it was built and intended to be built to used.
Right. Like if it has a if it has XML as the file extension, I can totally assume that this is an XML file, right, and not like JavaScript or something, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
why would I check, right? But then yeah, then if somebody gets remote code execution and they're or they're now able to interact with the client because you didn't think about somebody misusing file upload or
Mm,
misusing text input, right? Like, oh no, people aren't gonna, do that, or they're not gonna nest this and that, right? Like that's how you circumvent these things. So, I think, yeah, keeping in mind that the like on the perimeter of functionality is where vulnerability exists, I think will also help us understand what's happening with Polkit. So, Polkit has a program called pkexec, right? And pkexec is what you're using in Polkit to essentially interact with these things at a higher privilege. So that's included with Polkit, right? And Polkit's included on most operating systems by default.
mm,
So not all containers exactly, but I think Red Hat has put out which containers they have that are affected.
okay,
But most operating systems, if you're installing it on bare metal, like like my Arch install or my Ubuntu install or something like I'm actually not sure about Arch, but I'll look into that. But CentOS, and Red Hat, they all RHEL 6 through 8, I think, all have this installed by default, right? In the
okay,
containers as well.
interesting.
Yeah, I might be a little off on that, but I'm pretty sure that's accurate from what I've been reading. So pkexec allows you to do something like sudo, right? And that's really what's going on here. Like
Hold
somebody's
on.
able. Uh huh.
Let's hold on there for me for a
Yep.
moment. So we're talking about Polkit, and Polkit has this utility within it that's called pkexec?
Yeah, it's a
Okay.
program. So you're basically using pkexec, which is inside of the policy control framework that is Pwnkit.
Okay.
And the pkexec command is the part of Pwnkit that allows you to run things as root.
Okay. All right. I follow you now. Thank you.
Yeah. So basically, to explain like how this is able to happen, right? It's basically because of the way that the C programming language handles command line variables, right? Also, it has to do with the way that it handles environment variables and basically out of bound access, like in memory on Linux. There's like no built in protection against that, against like overwriting data in any part of memory, right?
Okay.
So, there are a lot of good things about this and there's some bad things about this. Well, the bad thing, we'll get to the bad thing, but
Yeah.
the
Give me
good
the
thing
good
about it,
first.
yeah, the good thing about it is it's extremely flexible, right? And um, I mean that's really it. Like you're able to, you can free or allocate memory in C in a very specific way, right? Like in a very effective way, right? And so that's also part of the problem here. And that flexibility, right, is why like people are able to you can basically overwrite the stuff that the command's expecting,
Mm,
right? So we're gonna get into that, but basically the way that this is able to happen is because of those things, right? Command line variables in C, environment variables, out of bounds like access in Linux, right? And there's like no built-in protection against overwriting this memory. Okay, so
So when you
we're
say
gonna
that, it's like there's no, like, double checking that the arguments are what you expect them to be kinda thing. Like, maybe you expect them to be of a certain type, like a string or something or an array,
there's
um, or what do we mean that there's
yeah.
no checking, I guess? Let's dive into that a little bit.
So there's a little bit of checking, which we'll get into later, but the reason this is able to happen is because we're able to very easily circumvent that by
Ah,
manipulating the way that error messages and
mm,
character sets are looked up by Pwnkit psexec functions.
okay.
Yeah. So that's a very good question though. So basically, there's no built-in protection and there's something called argv, right? Argv is just the array and the array is what you feed in to a command as an argument, and this array is just a ton of strings, right? So you have you're running cmd, right? Or you're running your shell, you're running a bin bash shell, and then you're adding like flags, or you're adding arguments, or maybe you're setting up your monitors with xrand r in Linux, and you're just feeding arguments like the resolution and the frame rate,
Mm,
and which screen it's on and which direction it's in, right? If you use Linux tiling window managers, right? Like you're feeding in all like this long array of things to tell your monitor what to do.
okay.
And argv is that array of strings that is used as an argument to a command in C, right?
Mhm,
So this is it's going to be important, but argc is the length of that array. So argv is the variable because it's got v there, and it's arg means argument, which
okay.
is just a parameter for folks who might not be privy, and then you know that, Brian. But yeah, argv is basically an array of strings that's used as an argument, and then argc is the length of that array, right? Just a number, an integer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and envp, as you might be able to guess, are the environment variables, right? So like the path, right? Path is the directory that you're looking for stuff in for running this, right? When you're making the C program, and the path is included. And basically, when we're looking at argv, the first argument at index 0 is usually the program being ran. The second argument at index 1 is, anything that follows a flag, a parameter, as we discussed. It could be anything depending on the program that you're running. After the command line arguments in memory, right? We're talking about in memory. If you picture memory as like a contiguous block of space bits, then after both the command and the arguments, that array of arguments, comes the environment parameters, right? The environment variables, and the delimiter, right? Because delimiter is just like, it's like the cutoff, right? It's like if we're looking for where to cut something, it's where we cut. In a CSV, that's a comma. Um,
Mhm.
for folks who don't know what a delimiter is, but a delimiter basically just tells us where to cut something, where something starts or where something ends, right? So this delimiter, it's null, right? And that's between the command line arguments and the environment variables,
Mm.
right? So this is very important to understanding how this vulnerability works because this is what we're going to manipulate. We're going to manipulate where the program thinks the first argument is, right?
Really quick, Kyle, is
Mhm.
there I'm trying to remember, I know we talked a little bit prior to stream. Is there somewhere where you can, like, look a little bit at the source code so that while you're kinda talking through it, we can visualize it a bit better?
Um,
Do we have that handy? I don't mean to put you on the spot with that, but I
no,
I
no
feel like
worries.
I'm following along with you, but I could see how it might be a little bit more difficult. If we have something more visual, that might be easier to, follow along with in that
A,
regard.
a good thing might just be to look up how, like, for this part of the discussion,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah, yeah.
how C programming like argv and like I'm trying to see if I can find something right now, but basically just to give folks a visualization about how this works.
Well, like, I thought we saw somewhere or there was an article either in the one that we have on Sneak or, the one that you shared with me to, like, reproduce that we're gonna step through, folks. We're gonna actually see the execution of I'm going to try this out with instructions and guidance from my expert here, uh, of executing this vulnerability. However, I thought I had come across, and maybe it was in the repo, um, all that I remember seeing visually what you were talking about, argv, argc, like
Mhm.
the essentially the source code, but I'm blanking on it right now, and that's why I was kind of pausing you there to because I was gonna try and bring it up while you were talking.
I don't know if I
But
actually saw that, but I would love to find that.
okay.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I think I might have glanced over it while reading the stuff, so I probably missed it.
I see the example. No, maybe that's not it. I'm sorry. Well, in any
See if I
case, you
can
can
find
keep
it.
going. I'm gonna keep while you're talking through that though, I'm gonna see if I can find the, example to, like, show up on the screen so people can follow along with that too.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so basically, right after that null, we have the environment variables. Before that null, it's all command line arguments, right? And like the command that's actually being ran at argv0. So at the index of argv0 at the beginning, it's the command at 0, the first index, and then all the way at the end, it's the last parameter, and then a null, and then the environment parameters. So what happens? I'm going to throw this out here. What happens if you overwrite what is stored at argv0, right? What happens if you overwrite like the first thing, right? The first command line argument. That's basically at the root of this vulnerability here, right? So the ability to do that. When you're able to overwrite and see, right, the first argument in a program, it's actually devastating. So we'll
Mm,
talk about that later on as we go. So that's what's going on here. But to summarize all that, the cutoff between the command line arguments and the environment variables is basically null, right? And that's in any Linux program, any normal Linux program that hasn't been manipulated, right? And therefore, argv0 being equal to null would actually cause an out of bounds read, right?
mhm,
So that's obviously not what we're expecting at argv0. And then the program thinks that it's reading the arguments, right, as would be normal, but it's actually reading next the environment variables instead because we've moved where null should be. So the first thing after that null, right, is the environment variable. Okay.
okay. I got that GitHub repo that we're gonna follow
Hmm.
along in a little bit here. I
Awesome.
have that rocking and rolling and ready, so I'm gonna bring that up on stream here. So this so when you were talking about the arguments of a C program, right? We're talking argc, and then there's
Yep.
argv, and this seems to be one example of passing in some of those environment variables you're talking about?
Yep. This is perfect.
Okay.
So you can see pwnkit.so, right? That's just a file.
Mhm.
Path. We see path there. Path has actually been manipulated, and I'll talk about that as we go on. Otherwise, it won't make sense. But basically, um, this is the root of the functionality here, right, of this exploit. So when you're looking at this, you see in argc, which is supposed to be the length of argv, right? And then you see a pointer, right, a reference to argv, and that's an array.
Right there. Okay.
Yeah, that's what an array is in C, and it's just it's all good stuff. So this is exactly because an array is just memory, right? So it's just pointing to a location of memory, and it's like we got this much, right? That's basically what C is doing here. Okay, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I will pick up on it, or I might not, and Brian might just let me know. But
I got you.
I'm going to try. Let's see, to get back to where we were here. So yeah, argv, TLDR argv is the string, argc is the length, envp, right? As we see here, as environ is actually the environment variables, and you see that on line 8. Thank you, Brian.
Mhm.
So that includes the path. We see the path 2 lines below that, and the first argument indexed for argv, right, at 0 being null causes an out of bounds read, right? And that's a vulnerability, or that's not a vulnerability, but it's a weakness that we can take advantage of. Just for some ideas for folks, out of bounds reads are bad because
Okay.
what you can do is sometimes you can run arbitrary code. Sometimes you can elevate your privileges, as we're about to see. This isn't a new idea, but out of bounds reads, out of bounds writes, right, and reads are definitely, they're notable weaknesses, and they can lead to critical vulnerabilities. So definitely very important exploit for that reason. Because usually, like sometimes, you're not able to reliably reproduce memory out of bounds exceptions. And
Mm.
anyone who's probably come across them in their own code knows what I'm talking about because it can be a pain. So I think this being able to reliably do a memory like read or write out of bounds is very bad, right, for any program, because you can definitely pull back some other folks' data. You can pull back all sorts of things. You can, basically, well, as we see here, you can basically manipulate, you know, and escalate your privilege. But there are definitely other things you can do with just memory out of bounds reads and writes, that besides for just privilege escalation is the point. But the fact that you're able to reliably do this is a big problem. Um, let's see. So yeah, null, right? Null being at argv0 would give an out of bounds read. The program thinks it's reading arguments, but instead now to um we're
And we're
moving
talking about
to
this null right here that gets passed in, right? On line 14.
so that's a different one. We're talking about the first one actually.
Okay. Oh, this. Oh, up here.
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, that's for the end of the environment variables, I think. So we've moved where null should be, right? From some point inside of argv to argv index 0, the first index in argv. And the next part of this vulnerability really has to do with how character sets are handled when you save the environment variables, right? Because the environment variables are cleared, and now the issue is, okay, you've moved the null, you've got it so that the environment variables will be read, um, you know, instead of the arguments, right? So you're going to cause an error, right?
Okay.
And this is really good. If you're causing an error and it's controlled, you can probably do some pretty nasty things sometimes, right? So that's what's going to happen here. What we're going to do to mess with it even more is the character sets, right? So the character sets, as you see right there, it says Pwnkit, right? So Pwnkit is obviously not a character set. We're looking at UTF-8, we're looking at UTF-16, right? We're looking at ISO formats, but these aren't like that's not a real one, right? And then that shell obviously doesn't exist either, right? So what's going on? It's kind of strange, right?
Mhm.
So it's not UTF-8. What the program's going to think is, okay, I gotta convert this to something I can interpret, right?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And there is lconv open, which is a Linux command that is used, right, as a function in C to determine what to use to convert it, right?
Mm.
So it's going to try to convert Pwnkit, the character set that doesn't exist, right? You could call it UTF 1 million for all it matters, but it's just something random, right? And you have that character set, and basically it's just it's illegitimate, it's not real, but that is going to allow you to basically handle the conversion, right? And what you're going to do with that is like cause an error message, right?
Okay.
So when you use lconv open, you're able to determine what you're going to use, but you just create an executable instead inside of that go conv path actually is not included normally with Pwnkit. So
Mm,
here's a thing about paths in this program, Brian.
mm.
Um, if I were to do path equals Brian, and there's a directory called Brian, and then I did, path equals Brian equals Kyle.sh, right?
Ooh,
And
okay.
Kyle.sh was my exploit. Um, it's going to use that the conversion path that I give it to convert the Pwnkit char set. It's going to just use whatever's there as long as there's a path there. So you create, this is funny, Brian, you're going to like this one. You create a directory, right? You create a file inside of the operating system, inside of like where you're hanging out, where you're going to put your malware, and you name that folder gconv underscore path equals.
Okay.
That's what you're seeing on line 10.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So like I said, you could do path equals Brian equals, Kyle.sh. There's my executable. Let's throw an error in the program and have my executable handle it. And then my executable, in order to handle that, what it's going to say is, oh, I need to throw up a shell, and we'll get to that. We'll get
Hmm.
to that. But that's kind of where we're going here.
Okay. So let me recap to make sure I'm understanding here. So
Yep.
we're intentionally passing null into the args to trigger an error,
Yep.
and then the way just the uh is it PK executable is that's causing this, or is it Polkit, or there's something? Which part of it is the one that's behaving this way to where when an error occurs, it starts going down this path?
Yeah. So it's PK exec.
Okay, so PK exec, it's like, okay, I got an error, null. I need to handle this. Where do I go to handle this? I'm looking at the environment variables,
Exactly. So it
and
looks
then
at the
it's just
environment
creates this.
variables.
It
Yep.
creates, and then there's errors in the environment variables, and it
Yep.
creates this long. It's this way to kind of traverse as an attacker through the woods here to get to a point where I can start executing my own code.
Exactly, and that's something that we see with more sophisticated exploits, Brian. And this is very easy to do. It's really trivial, actually, but it requires some intimate knowledge of the C operating, I mean, like the C programming language and Linux operating systems,
Yeah.
and how they operate. So there wasn't an exploit for this for a long time because nobody could really just figure out how to do it, and now somebody's figured out how to do it.
Hmm.
So I'm glad to have all this awesome information, all this stuff to look at, and to be able to share it with folks. I really think it's the coolest job in the world. But
Oh, for sure. I think that
yeah,
it's really interesting. I'm glad you highlight this thing where,
mhm.
uh, one, it requires intimate knowledge with the like environment that these things are happening. So somebody can report like, "Hey, this is actually maybe poor code security wise that leaves you vulnerable," but we don't know how you can actually what use cases you might have to take advantage of that to do something malicious, right? And so that might sit out for a while where somebody's reported that. If I'm understanding correctly, I'm asking you to keep me honest. So that happens, and then it might take some time before somebody actually realizes something malicious that can be done through that vulnerability, right?
Yeah. So basically, there was somebody who wrote, and this is actually in that blog that I put out with Matt.
Okay.
So if we could share that again, that
I
would be
got it.
good.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. So in this blog, we actually do talk about, the reporter who put this forth, and I'll tell you their name. Actually, let me find it. Give credit where credit's due. Ryan Malone, Mallon,
Okay.
reported this vulnerability in 2013, but as called it argv silliness, right? And it was
Mm,
basically, okay, like here's something that you can do, right, with like arguments in C, and it's not great, and we should fix it. And the person did actually put a PR out there, if I remember correctly, like a fix
mm.
out there,
Yeah.
but I don't think it was ever taken up by maintainers, for the specific vulnerability. So yeah, I think that it was just known about, right? It was known that it was a possibility, but nobody really was able to like reliably exploit it in some way, right? People, you don't put two and two together for a while, right? So if somebody, there was a CTF too. Somebody mentioned a CTF to me, and there was a CTF where somebody had to get like privilege escalation by exploiting something similar, right? So if you were to take what Ryan Malone found together with that privilege escalation concept through environment variables, and you knew about PK exec, then you could probably do something like this
Mm.
back, as soon as you had that knowledge together, right? So that's somebody just didn't do it, and it was just something that was kind of looming in the background, and folks weren't really like 100% privy to the impact that it could have on something.
Yeah.
But Ryan definitely had some pretty good foresight, I'd say.
That's super interesting to me to think about. You taking like 2 different vulnerabilities and seeing how if you pair them up, you can maybe do something more advantageous,
Hmm.
as a result of that instead of them just standalone on their own. And I'm also interested in, and maybe not right, for this session today, but to pick your brain about your experience and maybe one of those moments where you might have had that you can talk to at least, had that kind of moment where you're like, oh, that moment you realize you connect those 2 things together. Imagine, like, for Ryan in this case, what that moment was like, "Oh, like, holy cow, I just cracked open the," you know what I mean? Like, it's gotta be such a cool feeling. I think the only thing I could maybe compare close to is, like, when I'm writing some code and building an app, and I get something working for the first time that I wasn't expecting to work quite yet, and it was like, "Ah, yes," it's such a cool feeling, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I think definitely what Ryan did was like foundational for this. Like Ryan sort of like toying with this concept of like argv manipulation in C,
Yeah.
and it was foundational for this work. And I'm sure the researchers who discovered this PK exec exploit were 100% inspired by Ryan. Like
Wow,
definitely.
that's
So yeah,
awesome.
yeah, yeah. It's pretty cool. Like definitely they must have come across it. They must have looked into it, right? Maybe one of them was at that CTF, but like, yeah, it's 100%. Folks share stuff. Folks talk a lot. So especially in security, I say you got to talk a lot and read a lot in order to be really good at security. You just got to talk to all these folks and like learn from them, and then you got to read a lot, right? But that's usually my advice for people just getting into security. Like I put it in a video one time because everyone's like, how to become hacker, right?
Yeah.
And it's not very easy to explain that in such a short period of time. So like I made a whole video about like, hey, you're trying to break into security, I have no idea about you, but here's some stuff you can do.
Cool, yeah. Love to check
Yeah,
that out sometime.
yeah, yeah, definitely. I'll share that with you. But yeah, I think basically just talking to folks, reading research, right? Like learning intimately, right? So these people were definitely just so interested in the way that C worked, right? That they wanted to understand it in a better way. And then they looked into everything, right? They from bolts to nuts, right? They looked at
Mhm.
the way that it handles arguments. They looked at the way that it handles environment variables, and then they were basically able to figure out, okay, like if I manipulate environment variables, right? What's the perimeter of functionality? Like, what are all the things I can do with it, right? If I manipulate, the arguments, right? Like argv, like what's the perimeter of functionality for that, right? Like the confines of it, we know there's a delimiter, we know it's null, right? We know argv0 is usually, the program, the executable that we're running. So that's really how this happened, right? Like
Yeah.
somebody looking at the perimeter functionality for C programming in Linux and the way that executables are made, right? When we actually make them and we actually like, run the command. Like, that's really what I guess got these people going, right? And they
Mhm.
were able to just do all this work off of that. So I think that's really cool.
You kinda have, so in order to, like, do this type of work, and I know we're talking more general, we'll get back into the weeds of Pwnkit here in just a moment, but
Yeah.
you kinda have to have, like, this, not maybe not have to, but generally speaking, it seems like a common trait with folks that are interested in this type of stuff. You just have to have this tinkerer mindset, or you tend to have this tinkerer mindset where you wanna understand something beyond the surface level. Like, it could be with anything, right? In this case, it's with the C programming language and how they manipulate the chance to manipulate environment variables to manipulate the behavior of that program.
Hmm.
Um, or in real life, like other examples, like maybe your dryer stops working, and like instead of calling somebody up right away to understand what's going on, you like, you know what, I'm gonna take this apart and see what's happening on the inside. Maybe I can spot what's wrong with it, right? Maybe I can
Definitely.
understand how to manipulate that in a way that gets it back working again, or just as an example. But like going beyond the surface, things don't have to be just a black box to us. We can maybe try and explore it and have that uh curious approach to things, huh? That seems to be common.
Definitely. I think that's a common trait, between software engineers or developers and, security engineers or, hackers. So I think very, very common, themes for sure, like the desire to like learn while by doing, right?
Yeah.
So I think anyone who learns by doing, is kind of like a hacker. So when you think about it, it's a similar mindset, right? So I think that stuff's really cool, and I do appreciate that observation.
Yeah.
Um,
So where
should
do
we
where do we go from here from now for getting back to Pwnkit a little bit?
Yeah, let's basically go back. Okay, so we talked about lconv open, which is basically a Linux command that's used as a function inside a C to determine the correct conversion library for a character set.
Mhm.
So if we throw up that code again, Brian, we'll actually take a look at how that's being manipulated.
Got you. There we go.
Awesome. So we see that path, right? And then gconv path, right? We have that there. So normally that isn't included in Pwnkit, but it's actually going to resolve that because
Okay.
as we said, we could do any sort of directory there, and we're naming the directory gconv underscore path in order to fool it and pick this up as the conversion library. It's normally not allowed in Pwnkit,
Okay.
right? Or sorry, not Pwnkit. It's not allowed
In
in
Pwnkit or
pkexec.
okay.
So it will go to that dir, right? It will go to goconv path, a goconv underscore path equals, and then it will pick up that path and it will say, okay, this is the path where the conversion library is, and then it will pick up that here actually, so it'll pick up that executable too, and then adding shell and char set right as environment variables basically allows us to manipulate the validate environment variables function, right? And the
Mhm.
validate environment variables function is used to, like what we talked about in the beginning, right? We were talking about how there isn't a lot of protection for memory, but it's used to validate the environment variable functions, right? But we're circumventing that by using shell and char set. And you're probably going to ask, right? Or somebody might have the question like, how are we circumventing that, right? So if the shell isn't valid, it throws an error message, right?
Okay.
And when it throws an error message, right, it's going to like we succeeded, like we're going to get a shell back, right? And we'll get into that. But
Mm.
by control, so basically the TLDR here, to sum all that up, right, is by controlling the module performing the conversion, we can actually execute malicious code, right? We just create and include the conversion module ourselves. That's
Okay.
that's what we're doing here. So it makes it so that our code's the first environment variable that's picked up right after the null, right? So
Yeah.
we put a null in argv0. The next thing is pwnkit.so right there, right? And that's some code.
Yeah.
And all that code is going to do is create a root shell for us and then say bye-bye, right?
Mhm.
So it's pretty sweet. It's really good for, an attacker. So you set the environment. Okay, so here's the whole TLDR, right? Like just to go over everything we talked about from the beginning for folks who like maybe weren't here like throughout the whole thing. Hopefully this wraps it all together. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in chat. I know this is kind of complicated. Set the arguments array to null, right? argv0 is now null. Goodbye arguments, blast them away. They're
Mhm.
lost to memory.
Okay.
Set the environment variable to, and this is in quotes, right? Exploit, right? Wherever your exploit is, right? Set the environment variables as we see right there on line 9 to your exploit. And then the next environment variable, right? So that's what we see there, that path, right? The path containing our file path that looks like a environment variable, right? So
Mhm.
path equals that path, and
Mhm.
then equals dot, right? And
Which is
that's
the
just saying
current
current
directory.
directory.
Yeah.
And shell equals something that's not really a shell. It
Mhm.
won't find it. It'll throw an error. And then character set is not UTF-8. Anything else, just not UTF-8. Anything that does not exist, right? So it can't be UTF-16. It can't be UTF-8. It can't be any common thing. And then you just put a null at the end, right? So you just throw a null at the end. And
Okay.
then you got to create that directory, right? You got to create that directory in the path. So you create a folder literally called gconv underscore path equals.
Okay.
And then you put your executable inside of that directory. That's your exploit.
Which would be this again, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then you just run pkexec.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you got a
And
root
then
shell.
the result of this, when you say root shell, meaning I elevate my privileges and I can then do anything within that operating system
Exactly. You've
under
got the
root.
lay of the land on that box, so to speak. You can reach every corner of that box, right? You can see
Okay.
everything going on it, everything that's, coming in, going out, right? You're basically, in control of that. You can do anything you want from, establishing persistence on the box so that it's harder to remove you and detect what you're doing. You could delete the logs. This isn't a silent exploit. There will be some logs
Mm,
and system logs just about this going on. It's not silent. So if you're trying to, if you're doing so, that's what an attacker would do. Basically, what I'm going through is like what, a criminal hacker would do. But they would go in, they would get rid of the logs, they would create a user, just anything, right? And anything that will allow them to establish persistence on the box, they'll try to obfuscate that, right? So either hide their processes in memory or, you know, um, hijack processes, do process injection.
mm.
That's what I would do. But they would probably do something like that to obfuscate their behavior and make it harder to detect and kick them out of the box.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that's good. Kind of. I think for me, somebody that's completely new to this, I can follow along with that for the most part, and I think I got a good grasp of this. Now, this repo that we're using here, is a proof of concept that we can kind of step through. Do we want to do that next,
Yeah, yeah. I think
or did you have
I'll
something else
just
you wanted to touch upon first? That's
Yeah,
okay.
I'll explain maybe the flow of the exploit one more time, like as it goes through the stack and as it performs all this. So when you execute pkexec goes to envp0, right? Because we've manipulated the program. It's no longer going to the arguments, it's going to the environment variables. So it goes to the first index, envp0, in the environment variables. It resolves the path to our exploit. Then it writes back to envp0, throws an error on like validating the environment variables because those are invalid, and then checks the char set environment variable, which is not UTF-8, and
Mm,
then it runs the conversion using our exploit file, and then
mm,
boom, you got a shell.
okay.
So yeah, Brian, maybe we'll talk about the impact and the severity, and we'll talk about all that after the POC, and we'll just run a POC right now. And if anyone has questions about what we just talked about, they can drop them in chat while we do that.
Cool. All right. Sounds good. All right. So this is me, complete noob, and I'm following along with this repository in particular. And I shared the link in the chat. I'll share it again. Let me pop that in there, and then we can plug it up on the screen so people can see and maybe watch the recording later. So a GitHub user by the name of Birdav uh, created this repo that helps kind of show and demonstrate using this, and I am able to follow along as newbie me. So I am using a code space environment to help kind of facilitate this for us and keep it isolated to some degree. And in their README, they have some steps that we can do. But there's also another blog post that Kyle had shared with me from the SecMaster, the securitymaster.com. I'll share the link to that in the chat as well, so folks can take a look at that themselves if they'd like and want to follow along at home. And so essentially install Git, depending on your operating system, you install that different ways. I already have that in my code space. And then you're going to want to clone the repo so that you have access to all the source code of it so you can execute this proof of concept and then get into the CVE 2021-4034 directory. And then from there, we want to compile the script using make command. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So no, I'm going to keep working there, code space. Thanks for letting me know that it thinks I wasn't working anymore, even though I'm actively in it. Silly code space.
I'm
All
trying
right,
to
so
save
let's
some resources, I think.
maybe.
Yeah.
So first of all, let me do who am I? So I'm under the user code space right now, and then we want to. I'm in the folder that they said as mentioned before, and let's zoom in a little bit so people can see that CVE 2021-4034, and then I'm gonna just run make. Right? Is that what they said?
Mhm.
Yes, and I do that, and that's going to compile the code for us, essentially doing what you talked about doing, right, Kyle? Like,
Yeah, yeah. So basically, it's running the C compiler and it's compiling the SO file, like we saw in the first line of the environment variable. So it's compiling that SO file and the C code. So if we can actually click on those if we want. But as we can see here, there's the args right there, and then the environ as we saw before. So they have the path set in a different way, right, than what we talked about. They're setting the GUID and the UID to 0 as you'd have to. That's basically saying we're going to execute as root, and
Mhm.
then you add those parameters and then you exit. Right,
Okay.
you add those parameters, you execute it, and then you exit. Right, so this is going to be compiled to run on this machine specifically as we're compiling it on
Okay.
this. Is this an Ubuntu image? I think it's an Ubuntu image, right?
How do I check that in? Do you name
You
right?
could do lsb underscore release hyphen a.
LSB underscore release
Yep,
hyphen A.
hyphen a. Yep, there you go. Awesome. So yeah, what's next? Actually, I think we have
So
we've made
next we want
execute.
to just test the
Oh, perfect.
Pwnkit privilege. So we're just going to run this directly in the terminal.
There you go. That's probably the executable name, and if we were to look at that, that would be gibberish because it's compiled, and C it will just look like a ton of random stuff.
All right. So I need to do dot slash. It's not going to let me copy paste CVE hyphen 2021
Is there no tab
403.
complete?
No, cat. Oh, maybe there is.
Come on, code spaces.
There
Oh,
we
there
go.
we
Yeah,
go.
there is tab complete. Sorry.
Big fat code
I was
spaces.
trying to copy paste and it was like, "Oh, are you sure you want to give permission to this?" And, I don't want to give
Uh,
more permission to something than I have to, Kyle. You
Principal
taught me
abuse
this already,
privilege. So
right?
wise, so wise.
So I was like, "I'll just manually type it. Why make my life easier? I should be more difficult so that I can be more secure."
I love it.
Just kidding. That's not always the case. Sometimes that's the case though, right? It's a little bit
There's a
more.
healthy trade off for sure,
Yeah.
for
All
sure.
right, so I'm going to hit enter. We're going to execute this. And now I'm in a terminal?
Well, look at that. You got the pound sign.
Yeah, what does that mean?
The pound sign. Say who am I?
Who? I'm Brian, Kyle. You know who I am.
I don't know who. No, I've never met you. Who are
Oh,
you?
snap. Look at that.
Who are you? You're a different person now. You're no longer code spaces. I don't
I'm
recognize you anymore.
I am now I am Groot. I am
Yeah,
Root. Yeah.
right? That's how it works. That's really how it works. So let's see. We can talk about why the severity is high, why this is important, what the impact is. But one thing that's pretty notable about this, Brian, and I think you might find this interesting, is even if the Pwnkit daemon isn't running in the background, right? If the Pwnkit daemon process isn't running in the background, this can still be executed because the PK exec executable is still there.
Okay.
And it doesn't actually seem to require the Pwnkit daemon.
Interesting.
Well, when the hack works, I am Groot turns into I am Groot. Exactly. I like that. We'll
Was
put
that?
that up
Oh,
here.
developer Steve. Thank you. That, yeah.
That's
Good
a
to
good
see you,
one.
buddy.
So I think this is pretty interesting because you can reliably execute a memory corruption vulnerability, as we pointed out. That's very notable, and it's kind of uncommon, right? Like usually memory corruption vulnerabilities are unintentional, or they're short-lived, or they're not prolific, or they affect a small subset of something. But this isn't a core component. Maybe now it could be considered a core component. It wasn't initially a core component of the Linux operating system, so I want to make that clear. And you
Mhm.
can just install it and uninstall as a package, and you don't really need it. But I think CentOS and RHEL are leaning pretty heavily into Pwnkit. So basically, it is pretty prolific.
Mm.
It's installed by default on most major Linux operating systems, but it is a package. You can remove it in most cases. You can remove it on most Debian-based distros, if I'm not mistaken. You can also change. Actually, we'll talk about a solution in a minute, but it's very easy to exploit. You get full root privileges, as you just saw. It's installed by default on most major Linux operating systems. It has been exploited on many OSs already. People have been trying it, and it has existed and been vulnerable since 2009. So this is the first we're learning of it, right? Maybe somebody's done something before. It would be kind of hard to tell. And basically, unprivileged local users can get root, as we talked about, full root access. So that's pretty notable. Like that's just like if you have a normal user, like I have a server and I let Brian use it for whatever reason, right? Like maybe to borrow some books or something, some ebooks that I own. And I have the server and I allow Brian in. If Brian got compromised by a nefarious hacker, and then the hacker gets into my server, and then they were using Brian's legit privileges, his unprivileged access, right? The little section of my drives that I share with Brian, then they would be able to escalate their privilege and move somewhere else.
Mm.
Right? They could circumvent, the protection that I had in place for just you to be able to access just my books, right?
Yeah.
So that's pretty notable. Um, Yeah, it's just very long standing. So it wasn't found for a long time. Here, let's actually post. I'll post Ryan's article, or Ryan. Ryan is here. Let me.
Oh, right,
How
Ron.
can I do this across all platforms? There we go. That's how it works. Awesome. So this is the blog. As you can see, it's from 2013, right?
Mm.
And it actually goes through a lot of the stuff we were talking about. If you want to understand how C deals with argv and argc, and basically how you can manipulate that, you can actually learn about that from this blog post. I read it; it's pretty good, and it is foundational for basically this exploit. But if you have really intimate knowledge of the C operating system, I think you can still get something from that. It's a really good piece, so you can get that in the chat. And also, it's not all doom and gloom. You can detect this in your containers if you have Pwnkit installed, right? And you did apt-get install Pwnkit or something like that, and you have some containers that have it, or you're running Red Hat Enterprise Linux and CentOS. You can actually detect with Snyk IAC if you have done any of that in your Docker files. If you have any containers that have this exploit potentially reachable, then you'll know. So here's also a blog post from us here at Snyk, and this was written by myself and a colleague. And basically, it's a lot of the information we talked about here, how this is able to happen, but also how to protect yourself from Pwnkit, which I wanted to get into a little bit.
Okay.
If you're not able to just update your operating system, or um, remove these containers or change the containers, if you're not able to install the updates, then what you can do is you can actually remove the SUID bit from pkexec, and that's basically you know disallowing this sort of behavior, that sort of privileged behavior, right? And you can do that with a simple chmod command. That's in that blog post there. So
Chmod?
yeah, so
Chmod. So I'm again, me just new to this stuff. I never knew didn't pronounce it that way. I always like ch mod, but I like chmod better.
I think it means like change something, change.
Mm.
I don't know what it actually means, but yeah, it's like there's chone, like see, I don't know, chone
Choned.
maybe,
Get
chone,
choned.
right? I think it means like change mod or something.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, change mode. So it changes the file mode, technically.
Okay. Interesting.
Chmod.
Chmod. I like it.
Developer Steve says chmod. I like that. Chmod. I feel like I've never heard anyone say it out loud, but yeah, I usually say chmod, like change mod,
I like
but
chmod better. I'm gonna say it that way now from now on.
chmod.
Just
Awesome.
chmod it, man.
Just own it.
Own it.
So yeah, so chmod is basically you can add permission to a file to make it executable. Tomato. I like that. I like that. That's a good one. So you can basically install, Pwnkit on any operating system. So you can use Snyk IAC to detect a lot of that. And if you've never used Snyk to find vulnerabilities, we are actually doing this event, and we are, enabling folks to find basically vulnerabilities across your code base for free with free tooling. So
I am waiting and ready to demonstrate that to you as well.
let's do
Now,
it.
let's do it.
Perfect
K-
timing.
If you all enjoy this type of stuff, you enjoyed learning about this vulnerability, we are running an event right now for you to join in and have some fun doing this kind of stuff. You can search for vulnerabilities in your own projects and open source projects, your team's projects, whatever, as long as you have permission to that stuff. Search for them, find them, be alerted to them, and then fix them using Snyk. And you get free swag as a result of it. Limited edition t-shirts, maybe some other things through a raffle that you have an opportunity to submit to, all for free. You just sign up on the website. The link for that here is snyk.io events/the big fix. And I'm going to drop that into the chat room. Bada bing, bada boom. Pop that up on the screen so people can check it out. This is where you go. And then, you click on register now. Bam. And you enter first name, last name, and email. Now, the key thing here is if you already have a Snyk account, be sure to use, when you're registering for this event, the big fix, be sure to use the same email as your email with Snyk. So that way it can track and know that you've track in the sense of you signed up for the event, like you're opting into it, and you want us to be like us to be alerted on our end that like, hey, I'm part of the event and I've completed a fix. Give me my swag, you know? So
Exactly.
that'll help with that. It's very important. And if there's any issues with that, we'll do our best to sort that out and make sure you get your swag and get credit for your fixes. So be sure to check that out. There's also privacy policy and all that kind of stuff, code of conduct. And then at the very end of it, and this is the part that I think is quite exciting and makes it even more fun of an experience to be part of this event is even though it's running right now and you're kind of on your own a little bit, um, at the very last day, so this runs until February 25th, 2022. We're going to be doing a 24-hour live stream right here on Twitch and YouTube. So you can join in, you can pop into the chat room, ask questions, get help from us, and learn. We're going to have experts on demonstrating, talking about security related things, developer related things in general, too. You can get all sorts of value out of it and the help that you might need to start learning more about finding and fixing vulnerabilities in your apps. So check that out. There's some FAQs. In addition to that, so maybe you need some help before the live stream happens, before February 25th, and you want to get sorted out. There is a Discord link. There's a disc to our to sign up and be invited to our Discord where you can reach us, like Kyle, myself. We're in there hanging out. I love Discord. It's a great app, great tool to like chat and be part of a community. And so lots of people from Sneaker there. There's people in the community that are into security from various experiences and levels of experience. So check out this link. I'm going to drop it in the chat as well, real
Awesome.
quick,
I was
so
about to
people
ask for
can check
that.
it
It's
out.
like you can read my mind.
Oh,
I
I'm
think
I'm right there with you, man. We're in sync.
it's so good. It's so good. I love doing these with you, honestly. So, I think this is a great Discord, and I check it all the time because there are lots of great questions, and I feel like as you answer these questions, maybe you feel the same way, Brian. As you answer these questions, and as you see these questions being asked, it like solidifies your knowledge in these topics. So, it's really cool. Everybody's helping each other. They're like lots of opportunities folks are sharing with each other. And yeah, I'll leave the rest of that as a mystery. But I really think that it's worth checking out. And I wish I had this resource earlier in my career. It would have made stuff a lot easier. Let me tell you. But yeah, lots of experts like LeRon from Sneak and Eric Smalling and just like Matt Jarvis. Lots of legends, just like tech goats, if I dare say.
Tech goat.
So
Oh,
tech goats, the
nice.
greatest of all time. I don't mean the animal folks, but I think we've come up on time here. And if anyone has any questions about like this PK exec or Pwnkit vulnerability, how to detect it, definitely just like let me know because we're gonna help you as much as we can, and we can help you a lot. So definitely feel free to join the Discord, and if you have never fixed a security vulnerability before, maybe ask us some questions in the big fix and we'll help you get Sneak set up, and you can even make automatic pull requests. I think this is the coolest thing. This helped me a lot throughout my career because I was a security engineer. For folks who don't know, I led security engineering AppSec teams, and I've built them, I've been a part of them. So Snick really made my job easier, and that's why I work here now because I just like really like what we're doing, and I was able to use it for free a lot. So yeah, if you have any questions about finding vulnerabilities and maybe you wanna lead the security surge on your team to like bringing these vuln counts down, let us know. Also, I think the coolest part is you do get a T-shirt that we're only going to give out now, and I'm a sucker for those limited T-shirts. And you will be helping us set a world record. You will be a part of that, so nobody can take that away from you. Somebody can take your T-shirt, but nobody can take away the world record. So, like, I think it's a really awesome opportunity, and I'd love to help you get started on your security journey. So definitely feel free to reach out to either of us. We can throw up our Twitter handles here, and I think we'll probably call it after that. Thank you, everyone.
There you go. Thank you all so much for joining us for another episode of Vulns Unleashed, episode 2 on Pwnkit. On behalf of myself and Kyle here, your hosts for this show, we appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one wherever you are in the world. Peace out.
Bye, developer Steve. Bye, Jason.